Pain. It still is today. The CFA dispute in Victoria that saw tempers flare between the federal government and the Victorian government. This is the proposed enterprise agreement between the CFA, Country Fire Authority in Victoria, and the union, the Firefighters Union, and the volunteer firefighters that have long provided the backbone of the CFA in Victoria are worried about the impact it will have on them. So, as promised today, a week ahead of Parliament coming back federally, the Prime Minister and the Employment Minister have released draft legislation, changes to the Federal Fair Work Act that they say will protect the volunteer firefighters. With me now is the Employment Minister, Michaelia Cash. Thank you for your time.
Fantastic to be with you.
So let me firstly ask you, why do we need this federal change, the draft legislation you've outlined today?
They are currently negotiating an enterprise agreement.
Yep.
An enterprise agreement is a federal instrument and they are made under the Fair Work Act. So the legislative change that we are proposing is to amend Section 12 of the Fair Work Act to create an additional objectionable term, and that objectionable term would apply to any clause in an enterprise agreement that it basically seeks to undermine the capacity of, let's say, the CFA to basically deal with its volunteers. Right. I'll show you the legislation, David, just so you know. It literally is, this is it, this is as thick as it gets. It literally is a new term here, an objectionable emergency management term, and it is just set out here. So it's a very simple amendment. There's not a lot to the legislation,
so
but
the key is there that it can't, that the EBA cannot. What's the word?
Basically undermine.
So your worry is that the current EBA that's being negotiated, the proposed EBA, does undermine.
Absolutely.
Why do you say that?
Okay, so when you look at the history of this situation, you've had the Minister, Jane Garrett, who was so fundamentally opposed to what Daniel Andrews was trying to do with the UFU that she was forced to resign. You have the original CFA board. They were so opposed to what was occurring. They were so worried about the impact on the CFA to manage its volunteers. They were sacked.
So why? What's in this proposed agreement?
Basically, there are a number of clauses which impact the way the CFA are able to deploy or command their volunteers. So, for example, there's a clause in it, and it's clause 43.2.7, that basically says the CFA will also ensure that there is a minimum of 7 professional firefighters to fireground incidents that professional firefighters are dispatched to before commencement of safe firefighting operations.
Now, what does this mean? This 7 on the ground issue is one of the key sticking points.
It very much is, and there's been different interpretations depending on who you talk to. Certainly the CFA themselves...
What's your interpretation of it?
My interpretation of it is this. At the moment, there's, let's say, a burning car, for simplicity, a burning car. Volunteers arrive, they put out the fire. Paid firefighters arrive, they put out the fire. That is the way it currently works. This is a new clause which says that until 7 professional firefighters to fireground incidents that professional firefighters are dispatched to before commencement of safe firefighting operations, there is a lot of confusion around that clause.
What's your understanding what that means?
My understanding is there needs to be a minimum of 7 firefighters dispatched before safe firefighting operations can commence.
What does safe firefighting operations mean?
Well, it's actually, I cannot find it within this agreement.
Because Clause 7A of the agreement says it does not require 7 professional firefighters to be physically at the fireground before commencement of firefighting operations.
Well, again, when you actually read this agreement, a number of the clauses intersect, and it's certainly been raised
by... Have you read the agreement
now? I have the agreement in front of me. Absolutely. Yes, I have.
Because you hadn't this morning.
Yes, I had read it this morning.
You said you'd been briefed on it.
But I've actually read the agreement and obviously briefed on it in detail.
All right, because
one of the big issues
this clause,
is this.
It says 7, it does not require 7 professional firefighters physically be at the fireground before the commencement of firefighting. That's pretty
And again, though, regardless of whether it's actually physically present or dispatched, it is a fundamental change in the way the CFA currently manage their firefighters. And I put this to you and your listeners. The CFA board that was sacked can't be wrong. Jane Garrett, the minister, and hey, not a minister on my side of politics, but she was so offended by what was going on, she was forced to resign.
Well, can the chief fire officer at the CFA be wrong? Because he says this proposed agreement won't alter his ability to direct the firefighting.
Again, there are varying interpretations, but certainly you look at the most recent comments from Frances Diver, who's just taken over as the CEO. She herself admits that there is a lot of confusion surrounding this agreement.
Well, yeah,
but at the end of the day, can I just take it back to?
But take it back to. The Services Commissioner doesn't seem to have a problem with it. Let's just get to the detail of what's in there.
The detail of what's in the agreement.
Clause, 7A.1 says the role of volunteers in fighting bushfires and maintaining community safety and delivering high-quality services to the public in remote and regional areas and in integrated stations is not altered by this agreement.
Well, I completely disagree with that clause. And can I say, 60,000 volunteers cannot be wrong. When you read the different clauses within the agreement, they intersect. But something as basic as...
So what's the one that worries you most? Is it...
Oh, there's no one clause, David. There is no one clause.
So what's the concern? What's wrong with this agreement?
This agreement undermines the CFA in Victoria because it seeks to undermine the way the CFA currently manage their volunteers.
Just show me how it does that.
Well, exactly. OK, so in terms of chains of command, for example, there are circumstances in the agreement whereby if you go through it, paid firefighters can only report now to other paid firefighters. Certainly that's been raised with me.
Well, let me take you to Clause 7D on that. Clause 7D says incident controllers maintain their discretion as to the management of resources in the interest of public safety. Clause 7A.2, nothing in this agreement shall prevent volunteers from providing the services normally provided by such volunteers without remuneration.
And then when you actually go through the agreement, and I can't actually find what you're referring to here.
Clause 7A.2.
7A.2.
Just on the page right there.
7A.2. I can assure you, and again, there were certain tweaks made to the agreement, OK, based on all of the consultation. The CFA are still not satisfied that any of what you are proposing is good enough to override the agreement. Again, a minister resigned, forced to resign.
I know the board was sacked, but I'm just worrying about the agreement. What can you point to in the agreement?
Well, as I said, there are a number here. So, for example, you have a look at the consultation in terms of CFA policies. Let's go to clause 41.4. On commencement of this agreement, all CFA policies that affect the application or operation of this agreement or the work of employees covered by this agreement will be reviewed by the parties under clause 21. That talks about the union and the fact that the union has... please, David.
What worries you about that?
It's a fundamental change in the way we are currently doing business. If you look at, and I haven't actually marked it up here, but even right down to uniform, etc. Why do you need these clauses in an agreement? Why do you seek to undermine 60,000 people? And it's not just obviously the CFA. You are talking about volunteers across Australia.
Now, do you accept that this is only in about 31, at tops 34, of the fire stations out of 1,200 fire stations? So most of the rural and regional
integrated fire stations
won't be affected by this.
The impact on morale, David, I have met hundreds now, if not, I met 3,000, you know, on the steps of Parliament House. And can I tell you, they are all incredibly concerned, All we're seeking to do is stand alongside the volunteers. And I would hope people can put politics aside
and say... Well, where you were
today,
you were in Coldstream
Yep,
today,
Coldstream in Tony Smith's electorate in Casey.
Will they be affected by this?
Yes, they will. And certainly, regardless of whether it's a direct effect or an indirect effect. We had a man there today, Don. He remembered fighting fires back in 1962. 1962. Ash Wednesday is still fresh in his mind. And as he said to the Prime Minister, and this was broadcast, I think, at the time, this fight is their Ash Wednesday. This fight is their Ash Wednesday. And they've called on not just the federal government, they've called on the opposition and the Greens themselves.
So just to finish, what will happen to Don if this agreement goes through?
If this agreement goes through, or if this particular agreement in its current form goes through, well, basically, that's why we seek to change Section 12 to create a new term. So the agreement...
What happens to Don if you don't succeed? If this proposed agreement goes through, what happens to Don?
Well, I would hope Don doesn't resign, as so many have already started doing.
What would happen to him?
Well, again, though, it's not just what would happen to Don, it's the impact on Don of the Victorian state government saying, we are going to side with the United Firefighters Union over you, the volunteers. 60,000 volunteers who put their lives on the line to help their fellow man. What is wrong with the status quo? That is the question
But I'm just trying to
that
get
people
the
need to
specific of
answer.
what would actually happen to him? What would the impact be on a long-serving, very honourable,
you'd need to
hard-working
ask that
volunteer?
person,
No, I'm
but
just asking,
again-
you're the one wanting to intervene.
No. So you'd need to ask that particular person, but certainly they feel so affronted that many have said they will resign or are already resigning. There is so much confusion about what the agreement itself does or doesn't mean. They feel that their autonomy is being taken away from them, and you've seen the clauses that we have referred to. So again, if there is no objectionable term in the agreement will be approved by the Fair Work Commission. In the event, though, that the volunteers put their hands up and say there is, the Fair Work Commission will need to take a very good look at the agreement. But again, we made a promise in the election that we would stand with the CFA and with the volunteers and honour them, respect them and ensure that they are not subjected to what is a hostile union takeover. It's a very small change that we propose. I mean, you've seen it. That is the length and breadth of the legislation. It's not often you get legislation that is quite frankly as concise as this. It is just a small change to Section 12 to ensure that the ability for the CFA to manage its volunteers is not undermined. Right. That's it.
Employment Minister Michaelia Cash, thank you very much for joining us.
Great to be with you.
Afternoon.
Thank you so much.
Now, the other main story we're looking at today, a report